Welcome to A Lawyer's Guide to the Galaxy, a podcast about geek culture by lawyers with your hosts, Ben Siders and Kirk Taman.
And welcome back to A Lawyer's Guide to the Galaxy, the podcast that asks interesting questions that don't have any answers with your host, Ben Siders. That's me. And the other guy is still Kirk Damon.
That's Kirk, as the captain of the Enterprise.
We are still intellectual property lawyers, and we are still practicing law in St. Louis, Missouri. You can find me, Ben, on Twitter at Benjamin Siders. You can find Kirk at KirkDMN. And you can find this podcast somewhere. I now forget where because we haven't been on Twitter in forever. I think it's
we keep saying Twitter, too.
Twitter. Just in case you're wondering how long it's been since we've recorded. So yeah, it's been a hot minute. Truth be told, Kirk, so we're recording this on June 3rd, 2025. I think our last episode came out in late 2024, maybe mid-2024.
I think it's more mid-2024.
Yeah, so we actually have two episodes recorded from January, I think. One is our Public Domain Day episode for 2025. Which we have not released, and another one that I now forget what it's about, but I know we made it.
Yes.
It's not been released. But we're going to release this one first to welcome you back to your favorite dorky podcast. We'll release those two after this out of order, but we wanted to just kind of get this out of the way to say that we're back, and we're going to try to get more content out to you more consistently. And we know we've said that before, too.
We've said that a couple times before, I believe.
But in our defense, COVID did happen, and it kind of screwed everything up.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing we had with it, and it's, we were talking about this is sort of what's happened with it. COVID threw us. We did a good job during COVID. I think because we were separate, we did the Edamame episodes, so those of you may have listened to those.
It was actually easier when we were both remote, because we always just knew we could set up a remote recording session. Yeah. And now with the hybrid schedule, sometimes I'm in, sometimes you're not, and it's been chaos.
And that's been a lot of the problem with it, is it's been one of these things where it's, we'll have a conversation and be like, wait, we should have recorded that, but we hadn't.
We started doing that this morning.
Yeah.
Before this one, we started having the conversation. We're like, stop, let's just turn the damn phone on and record it.
So yeah, I think that's the thing with it. So hopefully we can keep this going a little bit better. We know some of you have definitely asked for more content. We've had, we appreciate the fans that have come back and said, hey, when are you guys putting something else out there? I miss it. We're hopefully this will at least pacify you for, a couple weeks here, and then we can see if we can get more stuff going.
So today's episode, we're going to do something on trivia nights. It's a topic we actually had, I think, thumbnailed out for our very first season and just never got to. And then honestly, I forgot about it.
Yeah, we joke about it because we have a whole, folder of things to talk about in these. Much. And we often don't get to episodes. We have ones that we've done entire, outlines on. And just never gotten to, partially because something happens in the public event space that tells us, hey, we want to talk about this. A court decision happens, or quite frankly, some new Star Wars event happens. But that's also, quite frankly, I think it's worth talking about as well, is part of the reason we haven't been doing the podcast as much is because we haven't been watching as much TV and science fiction.
Yeah.
And so we just don't have it to talk about. Not that it's not being created, it's that we're not watching the same things anymore.
Yeah, like Andor Season 2 is done and out. I've only seen the first episode.
Yes, I'm the same way. I've only seen the first episode, but part of the problem with it is that I always watch Star Wars with my son, and my son has become an MCU fanatic. Pretty much since the beginning of this year, he has watched every TV show, every movie in the MCU. He's almost entirely through it. Now he's watching the back catalog.
That's an insane amount of content.
He's trying to find the 1970s original Incredible Hulk we're trying to find on streaming because he wants to see it.
You should try and find the Roger Corman Fantastic Four if it's out there somewhere.
Something like that. And it's it's just kind of crazy, but he's turned into a complete sort of Marvel freak around it. He got started with it with video games, and then got really into the TV, and now adores the TV. And he jokes about it. He said, but it's easier to understand than Star Wars because it's all in order.
Yeah, no kidding.
I'm like, okay, that's kind of awesome.
So we're going to talk about trivia nights. For those of you who are not familiar, trivia nights in St. Louis are a special thing. We'll talk about that in a second. But we're talking about your regular bar trivia nights. Both like when you go and you play the trivia machines where it's like up on the screen and you answer
Those
general.
Are mostly gone.
Yeah, mostly gone now. The general trivia questions. But more popular these days, at least around here, I see it a lot, is the themed trivia nights where, like a beer sauce, the beer place up the street from me, they just did like a Seinfeld trivia night a couple weeks ago.
Yeah.
And they do Star Wars and Friends and all these kind of themes based on pop culture properties where you can bring all of your useless knowledge, of which we have lots, to trivia night and put it to the test against other people. And normally these trivia nights are mostly just asking questions about the show. Like one of them was, that I remember from the Star Wars trivia night was how many fingers are on each of Yoda's hands? Right? Do you know what the answer is?
3.
3, I think. But then it's a question like, well, one of them's a thumb. Does that count? So I had to lawyer everything. So there's that kind of thing. But then there's also like some of the more formal ones, at least in St. Louis, they do these as fundraisers, where they're big events that can have 1,000 people at them.
Most
sometimes.
of them are for nonprofits, but I mean, some of these can be huge.
Yeah.
I mean, they can be substantially expensive to go to.
Yeah, the tables can be easily $100 to $200 for a table. You put together a team, and there are semi-professional trivia people who will compete and try and win, because there's usually cash prizes at the end too. There's 50-50s. Yeah. It's super fun. It's usually BYO beer. Sometimes they'll have a keg.
A lot of times one of the local microbreweries will donate a keg, something like that, so help raise money. I think one of the things to point out is it's as opposed to the bar trivia nights where it tends to be kind of you and whoever friends you're there with. When you're doing the ones like in St. Louis, it's tables. So it's always going to be like a table of 8. You're going to buy a table of 8. And you're going to bring the entire team.
Yep.
A common one you also bump into, like a lot of times when they're done for a not-for-profit, they'll do something that's related to the not-for-profit. So one of the not-for-profits that I'm a big supporter of is the Endangered Wolf Center here. They've been known to do a trivia night, and one of the categories will be wolf trivia, and they'll auction off one of their naturalists to be on your team for that round.
For the round, yeah.
And so it's one of those things where you're trying to buy it. Of course, they're going to know all the answers. They're really close to it.
It's worth noting at these things, like sometimes there is a substantial prize. Like I've been to some where the top prize is $2,000 for the winning team, which your table fee is a couple $100 usually, so it's a lot of profit. But the highly competitive ones that will have 100 or 200 tables, there are people who might, typically it's 10 rounds of 10 questions apiece. There's 100 points. There are usually teams that get between 95 and 100 right. So if you miss 3 or 4 in a round about a topic like that, like you pretty much have to pay for the expert. Like my kid's school did one where you can rent a teacher, and the last round is all teacher trivia. We did that fundraiser for the PTO. So it's really fun. It's a great idea. The more formal ones, though, will have like a slideshow, and often they will involve a lot of pop culture questions. One of that we do a lot is they'll play part of a song and then cut it out, and then you have to say what the next line of the lyrics are, and you have to get it exactly right. And there's always a jerk who will do "It's the End of the World as We Know It."
I remember doing it when it says Lady Gaga, and we're all like, what does she actually say in that line?
We had another one, Bites the Dust, once. I'm like, I know all these Queen songs, and he stopped it. I'm like, I have no idea what the next line is. Like, you think you know until it's not there.
Have you ever seen the show that was on That's My Jam?
Yes.
It was done. It's the same thing with that, where it's, they do the Doom Box.
The Doom Box, yeah.
Which I have to admit was one of my favorite shows during the end of COVID. Like, I was so into that show. It was so awesome. But those kind of things, the way you see it there is oftentimes those are kind of classic music trivia night type of things. You're trying to speed round questions. A lot of times it's also things where they'll do it where it's you have to get the artist, but they'll put the artist in the song or even just the song, but they'll put 5 songs with maybe 2-second clips back to back. Yes. You have to get all of them.
Yeah, we had one where they did Beatles songs. They played the first 1 second of the song, and that's it. And you had to name the song. We have also seen Star Wars ones where they gave you 1 sentence from the opening crawl. You'd think that wouldn't be that hard until you realize how similar the plots are.
Yeah.
They did one where they it was a packet they handed out. It was a picture of lightsabers. You had to say whose lightsaber each one was. So sometimes there's visual elements too. Sometimes there's pictures of actors, all kinds of stuff.
Yeah, I think the other thing to point out is occasionally there's movie clips.
Yes.
When they do slideshows, it's very common for there to be pictures. Sometimes they're associated with whatever the show might be. Sometimes they're just stock imagery.
Oh, yeah.
I happened to be at a bar one, and they were doing one of the categories was cooking terms. And they would just have pictures of somebody cooking a certain way. So, it was, the name for cooking this way with fire, and it has a picture of somebody with, fire in the pan, and they explained, what it was, and then you had to what the actual term was, which I actually I was traveling through and found this bar just to stop because I was looking for a place to stop. Had a really good burger. I didn't even remember where it was. Enjoying one of the trivia teams. And, they were pretty positive. It was flambe, and I actually was debating whether or not that was correct. They ended up going with my answer, but I left before the round ended, so I don't know whether or not I was right.
Well, I've also seen some, and this is mostly going to be a copyright episode, but trademark does come up. I have been to some where they put up logos, and you have to name what the company is.
Yeah, those are fun.
Which is also harder than it sounds.
There was an old game, actually, that used to be about that. I remember there was an actual game, and yeah, you had to get either from logos or from taglines. Mm-hmm. And I always remember that the one that they had up, it was the sample one on the back of the box, was the Star of the American Road, which is Texaco. There's an old, tagline behind it. But I always remember that that's their tagline because of the game. Like, it's...
Oh, it's on one, too, we did, where it was, they gave you the tagline from the movie poster. And you name
those
the movie.
are fun, yeah.
And the first one, I mean, I'm sure you can guess the first tagline. It's the most famous.
It's based on what you hear scream.
Yes, exactly.
How about This Time It's War?
Yeah. What is it?
This Time It's War.
I have no idea.
Aliens.
Oh, gosh. I should have known. Kurt's a big Aliens fan. So anyway, we're going to go over the IP issues with Trivia Night, and it obviously overlaps a lot with geek topics. It's interesting because there's a kind of a threshold question of whether doing any of this is a copyright problem at all, and then if it is it a fair use?
Yeah.
And we actually have a case that's kind of on point here.
Not really on point. So they've gotten into the questions about trivia about copyrighted properties.
Yes.
Now let's first off talk about one of these with this. There's a lot of trivia questions that aren't even going to get near copyright. Cooking terms is not getting anywhere near copyright.
Now, we're talking about stuff where you are either referencing things that took place or involve a copyrighted property. Yeah. Or using actual music or imagery or clips from a copyrighted.
So this is going to be things like, name the movie from the clip. You're going to do, hey, what line is this from? I mean, what movie is Show Me the Money from? Stuff like that. Those are common ones. You may very well see a clip. You may very well see music. You may very well get here's a song from a soundtrack. What's the movie?
Yep.
Those kinds of. So they're going to be playing something that's copyrighted work, or they're talking about something which is a copyrighted work. Usually, when they're talking about it, you're going to be music, TV. Things. Occasionally, you will get book ones and references, but most of the time, these are more pop culture. So there's a lot of movie ones. There's a lot of music ones, and there's a lot of TV ones. That's really what you're going to see mostly.
We can probably dispense with music pretty easily because these things usually take place in a bar or another place that already has a performance license, which will mostly cover your music. There's kind of a side question about sync rights if you've got a slideshow and things like that, but I don't think ASCAP is coming after anybody for that if you're otherwise paying your ASCAP and BMI.
Yeah, my guess is if you've got an ASCAP license as a bar and you're playing occasional music clips from songs you're already licensed to play in the bar.
You're probably covered, yeah.
You probably got, again, could they make a big deal out of this? Yes. Are they practically probably going to? Probably not. Just because of the fact that, there is a legitimate argument it's covered. Is that a winning argument? I doubt it's ever been tested and doubt it ever will be.
No, so I actually looked up once, like all these kind of lawsuits involving this kind of stuff, and I didn't find a single one. So this is not where these companies want to spend their time litigating. These are not, they're not big, it costs them a whole lot of money, so it's not a priority. It's more interesting with television and movies where you're using clips or visual because there is no equivalent to ASCAP. There's no big company that licenses all this stuff on a bulk basis. So then you get in, but there is a public performance right for audiovisual works and dramatic works and things like that. So let's talk about that. If I'm putting up at the bar a still shot of Luke's lightsaber, is it an infringement?
Well, I mean, so one of the things you bump into is effectively what are you infringing? I think Luke's lightsaber is a great example because one, it's a relatively straightforward. It's a prop.
Yeah, it's a prop.
We're showing a still image. Now, there may be a right in the still image, but let's sort of leave that aside because we don't know where you got the image from, but let's at least assume the image has some form of a public domain, aspect to it. If we're not talking about a physical image from the movie, we're talking about something that, hey, somebody's got a picture of the props.
Let's say I bought one of those high-quality replicas and took a picture of it on my desk and brought it in. Yeah. So now I own the copyright to the photograph. So it's just a question of the prop itself.
Yeah, and I think a lot of these things, when you get into it, then becomes what really is the copyright in this? Who's really owns this? Something like that where you bought the replica, you own the replica. Can you reproduce the copyright? No, but you also created the picture from it.
Yeah,
I think you're getting really iffy on if there's any copyright there at all.
Yeah, that's the thing. Like you're right. I own the physical replica, like the matter that makes it up. That doesn't give me any rights to any underlying IP in the appearance of the lightsaber. I bought it to put on my private shelf. Just like when you buy a CD, you're not buying a public performance right. You're buying a CD. You can play it privately for your own purposes.
Well, to use as an example, I bought an officially licensed prop replica. I mean, it's an identical replica of the Barbasol can from Jurassic Park.
Yeah.
Which functions. It has all the mechanisms in it. It's one of the coolest things I've ever bought as a movie prop. It's just so cool. Another way, we talk about like big movies that I'm into. Aliens is definitely one of them. Jurassic Park is another one. And I just had to have it. It's such an iconic thing from it when they did this prop replica. It's one of like 500 that they produced. But it's hard for me to say, like, if I was to show that to somebody, if I was to use that for something, if I even showed up at a trivia night with that and said, what movie is this from?
Everybody knows.
Everybody would know. But it's also one of those where it'd be hard to say that there's any real copyright infringement there because of the fact that, yes, there's a public display, right? But I'm so much on the edge and I'm so tangential to what it is that the copyright's actually in. You've really got to kind of wonder what it is. The bigger issue I think it gets into is, okay, I'm going to use a movie still.
Yeah.
Well, I'm going to, take a movie still and I'm going to zoom in on a section of it to try to get the detail into it. Or I'm going to use a behind-the-scenes photograph. Something from
or how about the opening
movie.
call from Star Wars? I'm going to use text, actually, that shows up in the movie. Definitely copyrighted and belongs to them.
Now we're talking about stuff that's definitely copyrighted. And yes, you're using a minuscule portion of it.
That goes to fair use, though.
That goes to fair use. And so we still look at it and basically say, yes, I think we now have a potential copyright issue here. And when we say there's a copyright issue here, the question with it is it a potential infringement? Now, I think there is an argument, even outside of fair use, to say it's not an infringement.
Let's talk about that for a second, because the copyright, we almost often say infringement. Why do we say infringement and not just copying? Why? Because infringement is copying. Why do we say copyright's about copying? And the answer is because not all copying is infringement. Technically, it's called unlawful misappropriation, right? Because there is an amount of copying, a de minimis copying that is tolerated that does not rise to the level of infringement. Yeah. It's not very much, and the courts do not consistently apply it from case to case or from circuit to circuit.
And I think the other problem you bump into is that you have this idea that sort of says, hey, it's not copyright infringement, oftentimes also bumps up against fair use, where the amount of the copying matters.
Yes.
And, courts are not necessarily clear as to which way they're finding. It's important because not a copyright infringement means it's not a copyright infringement. Fair use means it is a copyright infringement, but an excused one. And from a legal point of view, those are two very different findings. But they're so closely related factually that I don't think the courts oftentimes get into it.
No, because the amount that was copied kind of figures in both to the prima facie infringement case, and then if you lose on that as the defendant, meaning that you are found to infringe, you get a second bite at it on the fair use side.
Yeah. And I think the real thing you get into with these, and that's somewhat where I was sort of saying, hey, if I have the replica movie prop, stuff like that, that's where I'm kind of getting into it's not infringement.
Yeah.
Because I'm not really infringing the copyright in that thing. I'm not copying that thing. I'm showing that thing. I'm taking a photograph of that thing.
Yeah, like your distribution right, at least as to the version you have, is gone under for sale doctrine.
I own it, yeah.
But that doesn't do anything with the public display right, which is still separate. So.
Yeah, but a public display right in a prop gets iffy.
Yeah, I just this is all theoretical. This is the stuff of law school finals, right? This is not
exactly.
a lot of laws anybody's ever going to bring, but that's what makes it fun to talk about.
Yeah, and so I think you've got that kind of thing. So, but let's sort of leave to the idea and say, hey, let's use an actual still shot from the movie, which I think most people would say that is a copyright infringement. Yes, it's only a single frame, but that comprises essentially a copyright infringement in some sense in the motion picture.
And the lawsuits have been filed over a single frame.
Lawsuits have been filed over a single frame, and over elements of it. A lot of times it's not even a single frame. A lot of times it is a clip. They're going to show something where it's a 3 or 4 second clip. It's a famous line, something like that. Okay, you've got that kind of element in there. Then basically you jump into the thing that says, okay, it is an infringement, but is it fair use? Right? I think fair use is a defense. And fair use is the obvious defense here. Now, my guess is big professional trivia companies that essentially do this for money, that are doing this like as party games, stuff, they probably license the clips that they use.
I can see that.
Partly because the fact that they can afford to do it, and it makes sense for them to do it. Because now they know they're covered.
Certainly if you're one of those like simulcast companies where you're putting images up on like the TVs and doing it at all the bars that subscribe, you're probably getting the rights in a case like that.
Yeah, you're probably getting rights.
I sure hope so.
Yeah. And my guess is, quite frankly, those rights are probably fairly easily obtained. Because, the companies know why you're doing it. They really don't see it as being an issue, and they're probably quite willing to 20th Century Fox is probably willing to say, yes, you can use all of our movies and make trivia questions out of them because, why not? But, they probably say something like you can't use longer than, 30-second clips or something along those lines. But yeah, so I think we get into that. So we're now saying, okay, it's a copyright infringement and it's not licensed. which is why we then fall on fair use. Because that's kind of the one defense.
Everybody's favorite topic.
And, we've talked about it previously. Fair use is complicated. It is a balancing test. The real thing, I think you get into this with the balancing test. So again, 4-part balancing test having to do with the nature of the work.
At least 4-part balancing test. The 4 non-exclusive factors.
4 non-exclusive factors. So yeah, basically you have the nature of the work, the amount of the copying, the effect on the market for the original,
and purpose and character.
And purpose and character. And purpose and character. Most of what we tend to be getting into with this one, I would say, is the amount of the work.
Yeah.
Because, we look at it and sort of say, okay, purpose and character behind this, it seems to be a different character. You're doing it for a trivia night. You're not making a competitive movie or anything along those lines. Yeah. The market for the original, really, there isn't one. You're saying a different product, though we're going to get into that in a minute.
And the nature of the work almost never plays into it.
No, it never plays into it. So really what we're talking about is it's the how much did you copy?
And the answer is really very little.
Yeah.
If you're just taking isolated pieces like just Luke's lightsaber or a picture of the house from Home Alone, and there's also questions about that. I was at one, Kirk, where the whole thing was pictures of the settings, like houses used in sitcoms. Well, the way the house looks is just a fact.
Yeah.
So, in theory, nothing should stop me from finding the house from Home Alone and taking a picture of it, or going on Zillow and finding the Google Street View.
They're public houses. Sometimes people live in them. The house from the original Twister, is one of those. You can just go see it.
Yeah, absolutely. So, in that sense, if I take a version from the movie, I guess that's technically copyright infringement. But I could probably find other versions, or take my own, or something like that. So, some of those are easier to do, but that's not always the case. It's easy to. It's not that difficult to come up with something that is definitely covered and there's no alternative, but you're still taking a small portion.
Yeah, and I think the thing that really goes into this when you talk about it is, in some sense, the law school example of what is fair use is the use of a single still image of a movie to go with a movie review. And so, we really have the idea of a single still image from a movie kind of being the ultimate example of a fair use. Now, yes, it goes with the review, which is an express category that's sort of associated with fair use. But, we say it's going with a trivia question, something like that, and it's a single frame. You start getting, okay, well, that's nature of the use. How much is a review really like a, You can start to see that, it's really hard to get into it and say, hey, there's not a fair use here.
We should say for movie reviews, too, it's typically not an issue there because the studios will usually provide a press kit that has the still they want you to use, and you have a license for it. So, although you and I would both contend it's one of the strongest cases of fair use, it's usually also licensed either way.
Yeah, I say it because I always remembered when I was in law school when you used to talk about fair use, that was always used as the sort of this is clearly fair use.
The textbook example.
That's the thing with it, and because of the fact that it's a review, it was associated with a review, and the idea that you need an image to show something about it. Same way as you have to mention the name of the thing. You have to mention
describe
elements
what
of
happened.
The plot.
Yeah.
Those types of things. I mean, if you ever watch Siskel and Ebert, an old movie review, which I just happened to see one, part of one recently, they really get a lot into the movie. They talk a lot about what it was. Yeah. And that's part of the reason why people liked their movie reviews, is because, they were a simple thumbs up, thumbs down as a yes, no, but they actually analyzed quite a bit about what they thought about the movie. And that's why I think people, quite frankly, watched them.
Oh, yeah.
And read them.
Let's talk about, we have one case that's kind of on point, although Kirk said not really, but it's related. It's about a Seinfeld trivia book. The case is called Castle Rock Entertainment versus Carroll Publishing. It's from the Second Circuit in 1998. That's basically New York, for those who don't know. The case involved Castle Rock, who owned the rights to the Seinfeld TV series. They sued the publisher over a book called The Seinfeld Aptitude Test, or the SAT, a trivia book with 643 questions and answers about Seinfeld episode. The book had reproduced detailed facts, quotes, plot points from the show, and was not licensed. And so they sued to have it shut down. And the question was whether it is a fair use. Now, although you and I both feel instinctively that Trivia Night probably is, the Second Circuit didn't see the book that way.
Yeah, and I think one of the things to keep in mind is that the reason I say it's sort of not necessarily associated with the same case, this is a book, so we're talking about a published work which is unquestionably commercially for sale.
Yeah.
And that's the reason I think there's a big difference between that and Trivia Night, where we're talking about something that's usually a ephemeral thing.
The bar trivia, you're not paying anything usually to play. You're showing up and you're drinking beer and getting snacks, and then that's the trivia is just to get you there.
Yeah, and that kind of thing, or to keep you there longer and stuff like that. So I think you do have a little bit of the sort of fundamental nature of the use has changed, because one of the things we get into is it's now a commercial use. Unquestionably, it's a commercial use.
And that's what they said. Commercial use, and they said not transformative. The book didn't add new meaning or expression. It just repackaged the same expressive elements from Seinfeld for the same reason, entertainment value.
Yeah. Now, I think that for same reason is intriguing, because I would argue it's not quite for the same form of entertainment.
Because we've seen other fair use cases where courts get into real hair-splitting exercises here over whether the purpose is really the same or not. Like, the Warhol case is a good example of that, where they were like, no, the original Prince thing, the Prince silkscreen, was produced to be on a magazine cover. Yep. And then this new one, this new one was for the exact same reason. They didn't actually go after. Well, no, they did go after. They went after Warhol, or did they sue Warhol? Or did they sue Condé Nast?
They sued Warhol. I believe.
It was the foundation.
Warhol Foundation. Yeah.
Yeah, so for the exact same purpose, because that's who actually created the version of it.
Yeah, well, now owns the rights that were created.
Now owns the rights, because Andy's gone.
Yeah, and so, those are, so it's, this kind of thing, I think pointing out, the Second Circuit did find this to be an infringement. They found the fact that, they did find this trivia book to be an infringement. This is not the only case, by the way. There's one of these as well involving a Godzilla trivia book, but I believe that case was in England. So it may not be American law, but there's also...
England doesn't have fair use the way we do.
Yeah, and there's also a Godzilla trivia book that was also found to not be a fair use. Now that one had, my understanding is, it had substantial screenshots from the movie, because it was done as like a coffee table book and like a summary type of thing, more so than just trivia. But yeah, so you get into those things with it. The interesting thing is it's what's changed. And one, we look at it and say, okay, yes, it's clearly a commercial use, which, knowing the way courts tend to treat fair use, may very well be the simple deciding factor. This is unquestionably commercial. Yeah.
Yeah.
But, outside of that, do we really see that much difference? Well, one, it's a lot of trivia questions.
643 questions about Seinfeld, as opposed to a typical bar trivia night.
Which may have 10 at most.
Yeah, it may have 10, 20, 30, at the high end. Even the big fancy St. Louis ones are 100 questions typically.
Yeah. And 100 questions, that would have to be entirely on Seinfeld to be 100 questions on Seinfeld.
Yeah, like I have been to 100 question Star Wars trivia. Yeah. You barely scratch the surface,
Yeah, so I think that's the thing, that's worth noting, sort of what I think is intriguing about this case is the fact that it feels like they go out of their way to say that it's a competitive product.
Let's get to that, because the fourth factor is the effect on the market. And when lawyers talk about fair use, each of the fair use factors is focused on a different thing. Is it focused on the original, or is it focused on the new use, the new one? And the effect on the market is not what's the market for the new product, it is what is the effect of the new product on the market for the original. And here, you and I both instinctively thought, well, how could it negatively affect the market for the Seinfeld TV show to publish a trivia book? And this is kind of where this idea comes from, that mostly it does not hold up in the law, that I'm actually increasing the market, therefore it's not a problem.
I think it's also important, though, to recognize that the work being infringed here is the copyright in the Seinfeld TV show. Yeah. There is not a Seinfeld trivia book which is being infringed. There is no trivia book. It's the TV show that's being infringed by
this other trivia book.
And so the trivia book is impinging upon the market for the show, is what the sort of the thing should say. Now you kind of look at it and you're like, hey, how does that work? One, it's a TV show versus a book. There's some argument there that it's different. Now, books are what a novelization of an existing movie or TV show is a well-established derivative work. Which would infringe, an element of it. So I think there's something there to be said for, it's arguably a derivative work and would be an infringement under that and would relate to it, and that the fair use, again, cuts against that. But my real problem that I saw sort of with it is I don't see how it's infringing upon the work for the TV show. And the court kind of backs into it, I think, in a way that, I think we both are a little uncomfortable with.
They kind of argued that there's a hypothetical derivative market, like there's a market for derivative works from the Seinfeld TV show, and that this basically is in that market, and the fact that Castle Rock wasn't in the market for trivia books specifically wasn't relevant. They said the analysis does not look to whether the secondary work detracts from the market for the copyrighted work, but rather does it substitute for kind of a broader market space, including potential derivatives, even if they don't exist yet.
And then the worry I have with this is this feels like a follow the money argument. Mm-hmm. It really does. And the idea of saying something like, oh, well, because I made a movie, you can't make an action figure of any of the characters because that's a potential market, even though the movie's a rom-com.
Yeah.
It's like, wait a minute, where does this come from with the fact that that would be a natural derivative work? I get the fact that this would be a derivative work, and I think we've had findings that would say, again, a novelization, this kind of thing from it, particularly a book in this much detail, would potentially be a derivative work. Again, I believe that's what they found, actually, in the Godzilla case. But it's one of those things where you kind of look at it and say, but they're not marketing this as derivative work. They have no licensee to market this as derivative work. There's no indication they're looking to do one, and I believe this came out a number of years after Seinfeld had aired. I don't think this is, directly on top of it, where it would have been something that would have happened.
It was 98, so when did Seinfeld wrap up? I think it started in the late 80s?
80s, yeah. I want to say it ended in mid-90s, maybe?
Yeah.
I want to say it was in reruns.
If it wasn't after Seinfeld was over, it was close.
It was close. But, I think that you've got, these sort of questions of the idea of saying, hey, why do you get to say there's a market for products I haven't produced yet but might, and you can impinge upon that market?
Now, the one thing that maybe makes sense is to say, well, by entering that market, what you're offending is you're basically lowering the licensing value to license it out to somebody else to produce trivia books, whether or not you are going to do so. Once these are out there, well, now why would anybody else do it, right?
And I think that's kind of what they're saying, quite frankly. I think they're saying is,
which is less crazy.
Yeah, it's less crazy, but I still think it's the problem with it is it's you don't have it. And so you really feel like all of a sudden it's this argument that says, I can extend copyright into products you haven't produced and may never produce. And when you look at the idea and say it's a particular expression, as to what it is, that's kind of like looking at it and saying, well, since you wrote Romeo and Juliet, I somehow can have a copyright into anybody who writes the tragic romantic comedy, where both characters die at the end. No, it's theoretically what you can't cover.
It does feel like it's creeping into the expression idea dichotomy where we're covering the ideas behind the show. And there's some more language in the case along those lines where they talk about how, well, you copy plot points. Okay, well, the plot, though, is a non-literal element, and you generally don't own plots, right? You own the story you wrote. You don't own the idea behind the plot. There's that famous, only 4 stories, right, ever been written, and Shakespeare wrote them all. Yeah. So, I mean, you don't really own these plots, especially in Seinfeld, where there's supposed to be no plot,
Well, but there's also that famous comment, which is another thing they do in Trivia Nights, which is where they describe, the movie plot usually as terribly as possible, and you have to figure out where it is. So, deranged father attacks son, which is the plot of Empire Strikes Back, things like that.
The best Star Wars one I heard was son murders father in dispute over family business.
Yeah, exactly.
Dispute over inheritance. That's what it is.
Yeah. And so, those kind of things sort of with it, where you can say you can own no rights to that plot, But yeah, I think the problem we've got with this is you can see where, yes, this would affect the market for a future trivia book being put out. And that's something that the people who own Seinfeld would potentially want to do. And so it kind of makes sense that, yes, you're affecting that market. The problem with it is that there is no market without the book yet. And so how do you actually affect how do you affect the market that doesn't exist? Because there's no indication that a Seinfeld trivia book would even sell, if it was officially licensed or anything.
Well, I think in this case, Castle Rock had also said they had no plans to produce a trivia book. So they kind of admitted that not only was there no market, there never would be. Yeah. And nevertheless, the court said, well, it's a derivative work, and since it would destroy the market for these derivative works, it nevertheless weighs in favor under this factor. I think this feels like an outcomes-oriented case. We just looked at it and said, look, you just can't do this. You should have gone and gotten a license, and you didn't. And I think the Second Circuit in particular...
frankly, you probably could have. They probably would have given you one if you would have gone to them. Not necessarily because they
maybe not. It may be as simple as the people who had Seinfeld, like Calvin and Hobbes is a famous example of this. He famously did not want to, Watterson, license Calvin and Hobbes out for anything.
Yeah.
He wanted to maintain that creative control and not highly commercialize it. So there's virtually no Calvin and Hobbes merch, not officially. There's the Calvin peeing stickers that are everywhere, but they're all unauthorized. So, and maybe it's the Second Circuit looking at this and saying, it's Castle Rock's IP. They are allowed to decide what commercial products in this world are out there and aren't. And you can't just walk in and make one where they've decided not to.
I think the other problem you also bump into with this, though, and again, I kind of agree with that point, but I think there's a second problem, which is the fact that all of these trivia questions can be written solely by watching the show. You don't actually need to have access to scripts or anything else. which makes it kind of weird in the idea that somehow they have put a public performance of it out there.
Yeah.
And this is a work which is generated based on the public performance. So it's one of those things where you kind of look at it and say, like, if I went and watched a live, music performance, and, during the course of the music performance, the performer changed the lyrics of one of the songs. As for instance, like Garth Brooks is infamous for doing. And I talked about, to a friend that, hey, he changed the lyrics to the song. This is what he changed them to. Well, I got that from the public performance that was out there. The song presumably wasn't written that way, anything else. But I get it solely from that performance, solely from viewing the performance. And what does that mean? Because I presumably could write a book analyzing, here's the psychology that's visual in Seinfeld. I mean, I took film studies when I was in college, and you talk about, here's how, mise-en-scène is used in this movie. Here's how, the various aspects of farce is presented in this script. That's for educational purposes, but it's also one of those things where you kind of look at it and say, but I'm not really using the movie, I'm just watching it.
Well, in this case, too, they emphasize that the name Seinfeld appears throughout the book, but there's no copyright in the name Seinfeld. That's a trademark thing.
Yeah.
And they also talk about how the characters are used, but the characters are pretty distinct in that show. They're all kind of unique, some more so than others. But here's an example of a question. An example of, this comes from the public record. To impress a woman, George passes himself off as A, a gynecologist, B, a geologist, C, a marine biologist, or D, a meteorologist. Okay? I think the answer is C.
I don't know, actually. I have to admit, I've watched all of 2 episodes of Seinfeld my entire life. I never got into the show.
I've seen most of it a couple times, but I don't know it as well as the true fans. I'm pretty sure it's the marine biologist episode where Kramer pulls a golf ball out of a whale. But, or no, George, I don't remember.
George.
Anyway,
George.
It is George, yeah. No, Kramer's hitting the golf balls. That pulls the titles out of the whale. Anyway, but what is the plot point here? Somebody's impersonating a professional to impress a woman? There's no copyright in that idea. It's like the story is old as time, and a marine biologist is a cliche, and what's the character here? It just says George. Just nothing about the character. So
King George?
So I can't just say Seinfeld and George together in a sentence without infringing a copyright? That just seems awfully broad.
Yeah, and again, I think that's the hard part with this is this is one of these cases where I think we can look at it and say, we kind of get why this particular fact situation found this way, but it's very hard to draw any kind of general conclusion from it.
Yeah.
Which is, again, why I kind of look at it and say, this is not really on point to our question about trivia night.
Well, ours is even more attenuated than this.
Because now we're getting more attenuated, and so it's how much can we really draw from this? You can kind of look at it and say, yes, you can't create a trivia night. You probably can't create, a trivia book. You probably can't create a coffee table book, discussing the things with it. But what if I want to analyze the psychology of George? Can I do that? Well, that starts to get more attenuated. Is that okay?
Well, how about this? What if we do a trivia night that doesn't use any images, doesn't use any stills or anything like that? It's just questions articulated verbally.
Yeah.
About the book.
Yeah.
Is that okay?
Yeah. So the example is I think a Star Wars one. Who is Red 3?
Yeah.
There's a good example. The only reason that question makes any sense is this guy said it was Star Wars.
Yeah.
That kind of thing. So
versus if you said, who is Red 3 in any other context, wouldn't be like the food coloring? What are you talking
exactly,
about?
Yeah. Stuff like that. But that's the thing with it, where I've said nothing about the movie. I haven't even said the character's name. I believe Red 3 is a sort of non-important character. I think I chose
Luke is Red 5, I think.
Luke is Red 5. And Red 3 might be Red 6 is Porkins. And so I think I got these right. I used to know all these, actually.
Too.
Yeah.
We're losing it.
And so, it's those kind of things sort of with it. But I think you've got that question sort of, who is it, Red 3 might be Biggs, actually, as I'm thinking about it. I'm totally second-guessing myself as to who Red 3 is.
I'll look him up, you vamp.
But yeah, so I think you have this question as to, basically, who is it? I haven't mentioned anything. I haven't said anything particularly for...
You're right, it was Biggs.
Oh, I got it. It was Biggs.
That's a deep pull, Kurt.
Well, I was thinking about it because I think Red 3 is on his tail and he gets shot. And that's when he loses Biggs, and that's him losing the friend that doesn't make any sense from the movie because you don't realize how he knows Biggs because they cut the scene when they did the edit. It's one of those things where I think when you get into that kind of thing, it becomes very much as just sort of where is this line? And I think it's very, we've had few cases around there. And
we're not likely to get any.
Like this case in particular is so focused on, this is clearly a commercial product that, does take part of the market for a potential licensed product that no one would have any question could be made.
Yeah.
And so you kind of get into these things where it's like, that seems much clearer as something which would damage a market than saying what has a trivia night damage a market. But at the same time, it's where's the line between those? And it's just hard to know.
Well, I think the key thing. I think it also, this is one area where people get confused too, because I think the average person who doesn't know much about copyright or fair use just looks at a situation like this and says, well, the company's not making this thing, so how am I costing them any money? If anything, by making this, I'm spreading and amplifying knowledge of this IP. And although
that was used as an early excuse for Napster, by the way.
Yeah, exactly.
For those of you may not know that was a very common early excuse for Napster.
There was an argument, that this is no different than going to the music store and just listening to because remember, music stores used to be able to put the CD in and listen to it to sample it there. I'm just sampling, but you're also keeping all the samples. That doesn't fly. And that argument has some superficial logical appeal, but I don't think the law has a whole lot of respect for it.
Yeah, and so I think as a takeaway and sort of conclusion behind this, I think what we can really kind of look at behind this and say, there is some real question when you get into doing stuff like this, where you start saying, hey, talking about a derivative and really being a derivative being about the show. That's kind of what we're saying as trivia. This is something which is about the show, again, about the public performance of the show, about the thing that's sort of out there. Do we bump in, how much does fair use protect us here? And I think the argument we come to is sort of, it protects you a great deal, but it doesn't totally protect you. It's kind of classic fair use analysis, which is when it falls into the commercial realm, all of a sudden it really starts to get iffy as to whether or not fair use applies at all.
Well, then also there's always a practical consideration of, okay, let's just say that we're doing Star Wars Trivia Night and Disney decides to come in and raise a ruckus about it. What are the damages?
Yeah.
I guess you say statutory damages, but setting that aside, that could be messy too, because you may be using stuff from 15 or 20 different movies, each of which has its own statutory, or TV episodes where each one is separately copyrighted. Yeah. But setting statutory damages aside, what's the real damages here? Yeah. Do they offer a license for this kind of thing? And if they don't, then what are they out? I think it's hard to put the book's a little easier to say there's a derivative market we can't enter and we've chosen not to enter it, so you got to stay out of it. But for Trivia Night, where I'm not selling anything that is Star Wars branded or is otherwise branded by the IP, I think it's a lot more difficult case to make.
Yeah, and that's the thing with it. I mean, quite frankly, let's take it to an extreme. We do Star Wars episodes on this show.
Yeah, we talk about the facts all the time.
And now I think
we've done it in this
plenty
episode.
of argument that it's commentary. We are falling on a review, and again, stereotypical law school case that review is the thing that you get away with.
Self-evidently one of the strongest cases of fair use in the history of the legal system. So
yeah, but you really get into this question of where is this line, and again, I think the point of us in going through this and talking about it is this is one of those things probably many of you never thought about. You've probably been to one of these bar trivia nights, and you never thought about the fact that you're watching a couple things from a movie that could be a copyright infringement. You're listening to copyrighted music that could be a copyright infringement.
That's what law school does to you. It ruins all this stuff for you, where you can't help but see these issues everywhere.
And so the next time you guys walk into a trivia night, suddenly you're going to be like, wait, you can't show that. And now you're going to be telling that to the bartender. You're probably going to be too busy trying to win. But it's one of those things where you really start to see how pervasive a lot of these issues are. And I think that's the point behind it, is to say, hey, people haven't thought about this. It's not something you necessarily think about on a regular basis, but it's something worth thinking about, and it's an interesting legal question and legal analysis.
All right, so I think we've kicked that topic. So going forward, we got 2 more episodes we're going to put out that we've already recorded, one of which I've now forgotten what it's about. Hopefully it's still on my phone somewhere. So we'll get those out to you. And then we're going to try to get more content out. It's going to be probably more like this, where it's a little less structured and more of just a conversation, which, by the way, was the original concept for this podcast in the first place.
We do have a few that it's, I have one that I've outlined out, which is a little definitely more sort of, deep dive legal analysis. We're probably going to have ones, the Supreme Court's going to potentially threatening to get a hold of IP cases on a regular basis. There are a couple of major ones that may go up. Those ones may very well get into more legal analysis. We will also put out, for those of you who like our complete fluff episodes and analysis, yes, we'll find some science fiction to watch and discuss. Although I have the feeling we may go more wide-ranging. I've started watching a lot more of it. I watched Squid Game.
I've not seen that yet.
By the way, and sort of a variety of things like that. I've started to bump into more intriguing forms of science fiction.
Have you seen Fallout?
No, I haven't seen Fallout. I don't get the.
We got Last of Us season 2.
Yep.
There's a lot.
There's so much out there, so whatever it is. But there's also like less common things that we've just bumped into. I mean, my kids watched some movie which was literally an AI trying to take over the world. It was kind of a silly animated movie. I didn't even know what it was, but they were watching it. I'm like, this is actually really funny. Things and so it was the.
We'll probably got a lot of AI episodes to do too. We have barely touched AI.
We're gonna have to get AI episodes just because it's the hot topic without any question, and one of the big issues in AI is IP. I mean, it's
huge. Yeah,
it's
copyright
really bumping
especially.
up against it, copyright especially. But there's also patent issues in there. There's some interesting trademark issues in there.
Well, and the way that patent and copyright work with AI are slightly different, which is interesting.
Yeah, and that's an important sort of thing to do. There's also, quite frankly, just a lot of current events happening we may very well want to talk about.
We didn't even talk about the drama at the Copyright Office with the register being supposedly fired, or maybe not fired. We're not sure yet.
Yeah, exactly. Nobody's kind of sure. So, yeah, I think it's... we'll see where it goes. I think it's going to be potentially more wide-ranging. Hopefully you guys like it. Obviously feel free to give us feedback if you do. If you don't, let us know.
Yep. All right. That's all for this time. We'll see you next time. Lorem, play us out.
The views expressed by the participants of this program are their own and do not represent the views of, nor are they endorsed by Lewis Rice LLC, its officers, directors, employees, agents, representatives, shareholders, and subsidiaries. None of the content should be considered legal advice. As always, consult a lawyer. This podcast was produced and recorded in St. Louis, Missouri.